All right. Thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. Let's go ahead and get started. My name is Nell Champlin Nelson, and I am the Event and Program Coordinator for the Colorado Alliance for Environmental Education. We're so excited to see so many of you here for our first webinar of 2020. So today's webinar is Collective Outcomes, Lessons Learned and Next Steps. And shortly, you're going to be hearing from Corey Colvin-Williams and Katie Navin. But I'm going to go through a few housekeeping items before I turn it over to them. All right. So if you're not familiar with CAEE and the work that we do, we are a network of environmental education providers who are working together to advance environmental education in Colorado by fostering collaboration, mobilizing support, and driving excellence. So one of the ways that we drive excellence is through our monthly webinar series. It's an opportunity for us to come together, to share ideas, and hopefully spark some new ideas. I also wanted to take a second to tell you about some exciting events that we have coming up. So let's see, at the end of this month, January 30th, we are hosting a Project Learning Tree Early Childhood Training. It's going to be from 1:30 to 4:30, and it'll be at the Children's Museum of Denver. Then in February, we have a Train the Trainer workshop that will be exploring the guidelines for excellence in environmental education. And that's going to be happening near Colorado Springs. Also in February, for our February webinar series, we're going to have a guest speaker. You'll get to hear from Joseph Kursky, and he's going to be sharing with us, excuse me, how we can tell our environmental story through story maps. And then lastly, in April, we've got our 20th Advancing Environmental Education Conference. So lodging is available to book now, as well as registration for the conference is open. So I would encourage everybody, if you are able to attend, to book early because it is filling up. I also would love to take a minute to thank our webinar series sponsor, Marathon. Without their support, we wouldn't be able to offer these really fun and rewarding programs like our webinar series. And then just a little tech side note here. So we're using Zoom today for the webinar. And if you're not familiar with Zoom, I have everybody muted right now. But if you're having any technical issues, or if you're interested in asking a question or sharing a comment, please feel free to use the chat box. It's circled in red in the photo that's on the screen. And so I'll be monitoring the chat box throughout today's webinar. Also, the webinar is being recorded, and I will send you a link to the recording afterwards, as well as links to the upcoming events that I mentioned and any of the resources that are mentioned today. And now I will turn it over to our speakers. So today we'll be hearing from Corey Colvin-Williams, who is the co-founder and principal consultant of Blue Lotus Consulting and Evaluation, as well as Katie Navin, who's our executive director here at CAEE. All right.
Well, great. Thanks so much, Nell, for that great introduction. And I am super excited to be talking about what we've learned over the last year in our Collective Outcomes Colorado project and kind of where we're headed and where we're going. So just to give you a little bit of background on the project, we're just finishing our third year of really trying to think about what might a collective evaluation look like for Colorado. And we've really been focusing on 4 big goals. First, to understand how environmental education contributes to quality of life and to be able to tell that story more effectively. We know that amazing things are happening, but how do we communicate what those amazing things are and do that in a more effective way to bring more funding to the field, to bring more support, and to make environmental education more systemic? We also know that evaluation is super hard. Through this project, we're hoping to build capacity for evaluation and help organizations really strengthen their skills and how to embed this into your practice. We're also really looking to develop a framework for evaluating environmental education. And when I say develop a framework, we want that framework to really effectively help figure out what are the things we can measure and communicate about, and how do we connect those back to bigger level, community level issues that funders, stakeholders, and people in the community really care about. And then finally, we know that none of this will work unless we are involving funders in the process. And right now, currently in the world that we live in, funding is driving a lot of what evaluation looks like. And so we're hoping that by having more and more conversations with funders, asking them to contribute to this project, we build something that really aligns what funders need and what we need as practitioners to enable this to make it work. You can go to the next slide. So like I mentioned, we're really looking at 3 pieces here. And over the last 3 years, we've focused on different ones at different times, but what can programs measure? What are those things that we can collect data on that will help us understand what's happening? And how do we, through collaboration, through organizations sharing this data, how do we connect those to big population level impact areas and really connect the things that we're measuring in our programs to human and environmental health and well-being? So the way that we've been thinking about this is that right now evaluation exists in a pretty siloed way. Most of the time, not always, but most of the time, a program or a classroom feeds their evaluation to the organization, to their colleagues. We're using it internally for self-improvement. And then it feeds up to generally a funder who kind of holds that information, and that data kind of exists in that silo. What we'd like to move to is more of a within and between framework where we're sharing data across organizations. We're able to look at what's happening in environmental education as a whole and think about rolling up data in between organizations, because we know that no learner is going to become environmentally literate after one experience. And so by looking at multiple experiences, hopefully we'll be able to get a better picture of what that looks like. So that's kind of the goal that we've been working towards. And I will turn it over to Corey to talk about what that evaluation process has looked like over the last year.
Great, thanks, Katie. And just want to reiterate that we're really appreciative of you all taking time to be here with us today. And if you have questions as we go, either jot them down or type them into the chat bar, and we will definitely get to those at some point during our time together today. So as a recap, if you're familiar what we've been doing over the last 3 years, we went through this incredibly iterative process where we engage the community in various workshops and events to try and get feedback on what impact areas are most important to the Colorado community. And through that process, we distilled it down to 5 impact areas that just so happen to also align with the funding community, or a large portion of the funding community in this field. And those are conservation, education, health and wellness, social justice, and positive youth development. Those are huge. They're really great and super ambitious, but how do we know, I mean, what are we even talking about when we say conservation or education? And how do we know we are achieving those kind of best practices and impacting those areas in a positive way from a field perspective? Not that as EE we can claim causality or ownership over anyone in particular, but we do know that organizations are contributing to these impact areas, and how do we think about what that looks like in real time, and how do we measure that from an evaluation perspective? So, which led us to these kind of what we're calling our Colorado Collective Outcome questions that kind of helped guide us through this work. So as we went through this kind of iterative process, we thought, okay, now we're ready to pilot this. Let's see what this looks like. And we knew there was kind of a two-part evaluation approach. One was to understand the process. What does this look like in real time, and what can we learn through just the sheer act of actually doing? And then the collective impact perspective in terms of what's happening on the ground for participants in these programs. So the process question was really about when we engage funders and the EE community to evaluate and understand the experience, how does that story of EE and nature connection expand and or evolve? So how do we know what we're doing, and how can we really speak to that with confidence? Individual organizations in the past have been able to do that, but collectively as a community, we haven't always been able to speak to that with a ton of great confidence and the backing of data. And then the second part of that is really working hand in hand with these organizations to build evaluation capacity and explore to what extent are these communities fostering nature connection, environmental literacy, and positive youth development, which are in part a part of our indicators, which I think I got my slides flipped around. So I apologize for that. This is a little confusing. I put one in front of the other. But so zooming out just a little bit with keeping those questions in mind, those impact areas that I presented earlier that we had narrowed down with the community, as well as what we call indicators. These are kind of increases or decreases across communities to understand whether or not we are achieving progress in these impact areas, if you will. So from like an ecological perspective, if you think about indicator species, that's kind of what we're talking about here. We're thinking about indicator measures or indicator data points within our community. So we wanted to make sure that our approach was doable, manageable, and feasible for our community. And we wanted to focus on impact areas that we thought that our Colorado community might be most comfortable with and best suited to address. The other two are health and wellness and social justice, which we'll get to kind of our next steps in a few slides. But our focus for this evaluation cycle was conservation, positive youth development, and education. The indicators of those were the 6 constructs of positive youth development, nature connection, and environmental literacy, which is big in and of itself, but includes knowledge, attitudes, and actions. And then the tools that we identified that we thought would be best fit for that were the EE21 survey, and we actually combined it with a super short positive youth development scale so that we could really intentionally measure that. And then qualitative tools, including focus groups and photo voice. A little bit about the tools, in particular the survey. We are also a part of a national case study group that's funded by Pisces as well, and being led by a team at Duke. And many of the organizations in the case study are looking at EE21 as a survey to use and have already employed it. As a way to roll up and speak to these kind of national collective outcome efforts, we thought that this would be a good tool to use for our community. And we feel like, and we still feel like, it gets at a lot of these constructs. But we'll talk about some of the limitations of using this particular survey in a little bit. So our eval strategy was to identify these indicators, apply the tools, and then we'd see what EE in Colorado looks like and kind of understand and explore those findings. So how did we do it? We selected 4 pilot organizations last March or April, I believe, and then engaged with them in an ongoing conversation over the past 8 or so months that included evaluation training workshops. We are about to host our 4th and final one, which will be focused on kind of communicating the findings. In addition to the eval training workshops, we train them on how to do the data collection using those tools. And we did tweak the tools in conversation with these communities so that they really felt like logistically they fit for their programs and their orgs. So we had 106 survey responses, 11 focus groups, which translates to 64 individual kiddos, and then 7 individual photo voice projects. And we are still in the process of doing data analysis. We have our survey results. We've analyzed the qualitative data. Now we're in the process of what we call triangulation. So we're trying to understand, how do we understand all of the different data points from the survey responses, focus group, and photo voice, and how do they roll up to those indicators and help us understand those outcomes we were trying to measure as a community. So the 4 pilot organizations, if you're not already aware, were Catamount Institute, Hart J Center for Experiential Learning, Lincoln Hills Cares, and Walking Mountain Science Center. And as I mentioned, I think I mentioned this already, but we were really deliberate in making sure that we were working with organizations who were in need of not only building evaluation capacity, but were also in a space that were able to kind of take on this evaluation work. We didn't necessarily want to work with orgs who were well versed in this, because we feel like the whole, one of the biggest intentions behind this was to build evaluation capacity in the field. So all of these orgs vary in terms of where they are in their evaluation. But we wanted to work with all of them to kind of help lift them up and build their capacity. Okay, so the preliminary survey findings, this is just a little bit, this is just a sample. The survey item is long that we used with these organizations. I think it's a 26 item scale currently, so that's long, especially when you're thinking about younger audiences like 5th grade and up. But what you're seeing here is the positive youth development scale that we included at the end of the survey. And I share this here because I think as a community, we often don't think of ourselves as addressing positive youth development. But in our experience as Blue Lotus and working with many different organizations around the state, we have seen this as a recurring theme among the communities. So this in part is to showcase what we as a community are speaking to and impacting, and it's kind of an outside the box approach in terms of understanding what our impact is. And so it's showing that even though your focus is connecting kids to the environment and building environmental attitudes, knowledge, and skills, you're also impacting the positive development of these youth. So we won't have statistical analysis, really robust statistical analysis completed until later this spring. But from a descriptive perspective, we're able to look at this data and say, yes, we see an increase from before to after. And a little bit of framing in terms of the survey, it's a retrospective survey. So really, it's a reflective process for these organizations in terms of they have a scale in front of them that says, before I participated in this program, I can achieve goals after. And so they're taking it at one point in time. Let's see, we have a comment here. What types of programs are being evaluated specifically? How long were the programs? That's a really good question. For the purpose of this, this data point, most of the programs were very robust week-long overnight experiences. Okay, so we'll move on. And then from a qualitative perspective, what we did was we analyzed these focus groups and what age group was being taught. Okay, I am just gonna, my brain is ping-ponging all over the place, and I so appreciate these questions. Keep them coming in, but I just want you to know Katie or I will address them at the end, just so we can keep moving and so my brain doesn't stop working mid-sentence. But keep them coming in, they're great. I don't want you to stop sending them in. Okay, here we go. From a qualitative perspective, what we did was we analyzed the focus group transcripts. So these communities audio recorded their focus group time with the kiddos, and then we transcribed those into text. And then using some analytical software, we coded these based on our big outcomes that we were aiming to understand. And what we saw emerge, what you're looking at here in the word cloud and in the kind of flow chart above, is the frequency of mention, or the frequency of the codes within all of these focus groups. There were 8 focus groups and 64 kiddos across those 8 focus groups. So it's a pretty good chunk of kids and program experience being presented here. But nature connection was super salient, and within that, appreciation and comfort in the outdoors. PYD, again, was very salient as well, and change in self. Change in self and PYD, no real surprise here, co-occurred quite a bit. So that was cool to see that often when they were talking about a change that they saw in themselves, it connected to one of the PYD constructs, including confidence and connection. And then environmental literacy wasn't quite as strong as the others, but that's in part based on how we structured the focus group questions. The survey really gets at environmental literacy, attitudes, knowledge, and intention to act. And so, Katie, do you want to take it from here, or do you want me to keep moving?
Sure, I can jump in.
Okay.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for digging into that data and sharing it with us, Corey. I think we have been super interested to see what is emerging from the data, but I think for this first year, and knowing that we were only working with 4 organizations, our primary focus is really on how does this process work? Do these tools work? What's the most beneficial? And so we're still collecting data on process and really thinking through what all this means, but at least preliminarily, I think we have a lot of thoughts about what this means moving forward. I think in terms of, as Corey mentioned, the organizations we worked with had a really varying degree of evaluation capacity when they started out. So our brains are thinking through, like, what were the structures that worked to build evaluation capacity, and what might we really do more effectively to build that capacity throughout this process, and how can we do it better? We also know that organizations who participated in this had no external incentive to participate other than their interest in the findings and in growing their own capacity for evaluation. So we are finding a need to create additional funding streams to help organizations do evaluation, and we think that's a critical piece of this work being able to really take hold and organizations be able to integrate this into their practice, is creating some of those connections that we can help support the time that it takes to do this. And so those are all things that we're exploring and looking at and thinking about. How can we create some systemic ways to help that happen? We don't have answers yet, but I think we know that that's something that needs to happen. We also really saw an interesting value emerge for the learning community process. So we had initially structured this process as a series of 4 workshops. And when you think about workshops, you think about building people's knowledge and skills in a certain topic area. In our case, it was around evaluation. And really what we saw happen throughout that process was it was less about the actual workshop and learning how to do it, and more about the conversations between the organizations participating. And that in order to really embed evaluation in your practice and develop that capacity in your organization, those conversations were a really critical piece, and the barriers that pop up to doing evaluation could more easily be solved by other practitioners in the room than by engaging like outside expertise. And so I know for us moving forward and thinking about how do we expand that learning community piece of this process and make more opportunities for sharing together and talking about what works and what doesn't work is really, really important. I think we also heard really, really strongly from organizations that evaluation takes a long time and it eats program time. And so I think going back, and as we think about what tools we will suggest and try to work to share in the future, we're really going to be thinking about how do we make these either as integrated into a program as possible, so it's part of the learning time, or so that it is something that you can do fairly quickly. Because I think we would assume and we know that when you have to make choices about tight time frames, you're going to pick learning time over evaluation time. So just as an example, in the two tools that Corey talked about, the focus groups that were done were in essence a reflection of your time together, which most programs build in reflection time anyway into their process. So that was a little easier to integrate than the survey itself and finding the time to take that lengthy survey. So we are thinking a lot about how do we make these tools as robust as possible, but really maximize program time the best that we can. Also really thinking about how do we continue to help build ways for organizations to meet funder priorities. And one of the things we realized in this process was that the time frame for the pilot was short enough that grants had already been written for the year. Funding was kind of already secured. So promises had already been made to funders in terms of what was going to be measured and what was not. And so really in thinking about this in a much longer process, and that organizations need time to build that in, so they're actually writing it into their grants from the beginning, what this process of evaluation looks like, and the process of building it into your organization is going to take longer than a year in order to really do that. And so really thinking about when we create a toolkit, how do we put these pieces together to make that as easy as possible. I think we also learned a ton about what's going to be needed in a toolkit. And in thinking about tools, I will just say our thought process right now is that a lot of this is very individual to an organization. And so we are thinking about this in terms of eventually there being a menu of options. For example, the EE21 survey that Corey talked about really is best for 4th grade and above. And so we need to make sure that we're looking for tools that can also reach younger audiences. And so this process and this toolkit will build over time, but we're really learning a lot about what organizations' needs are and what can make this the most effective as possible when we're able to put all the pieces together. I don't want to say at the end of the process, but at a good time to kind of pull it all together. So in terms of what are the next steps, we are still finalizing the pilot. And so as Corey mentioned, we've got one workshop left in which we're going to be talking about, now that we have some results, how are we going to communicate those results and what does that look like? We also are going to do a little bit more process evaluation and get more feedback from organizations on what were the most valuable parts of this.
Sorry, Katie.
And what they most benefited from. And report out on how all of the data that we found lines up with those bigger population level impact areas, and really be able to start telling that story. So that's kind of the plan for wrapping up this pilot year. I'm really, really excited about where we're headed in 2020 and beyond, in really starting to think about how do we use this, how do we use what we learned for collective impact? And one of the things that we're going to be focusing on a lot in 2020 is developing some communication frameworks around those 5 big impact areas. And so even if you're not using the tools that we've outlined or that we're putting in the toolkit, your work may align with those same impact areas and those indicators. And so we want to be able to provide some communication tools to help you link what you're measuring with those bigger impact areas, and really spend a lot of time trying to do that really well and trying to think about the best way to communicate those messages. We see a lot of power in, one, being able to provide those tools, and 2, if we're starting to talk the same way about some of the impacts that we're having, we develop a stronger voice to move for more systemic environmental education in the state. And so we could see a lot of benefits from really having a strong voice and a unified voice in that area, in terms of bringing more funding to the field, and really thinking about how we can leverage each other through our communication. And by telling stories about the good work that you personally are doing in your organization. The second big part of 2020 is really going to be on putting together the first toolkit. So like Corey mentioned, we weren't able to tackle health and wellness or social justice yet. But for those first 3 impact areas, education, conservation, and positive youth development, what can we put together in a toolkit to share out with folks so that you're able to use it as it makes sense for your organization? And then we are planning to host 4 evaluation training workshops in 4 quadrants of the state. So hopefully there's one near you, or at least kind of near you, to share the toolkit, share what we've learned, provide the tools that we have at this point for organizations that really want to learn from that benefit, and test them out and try them out so we can get more feedback and continue to refine what this looks like and how we start to feed up this data into something that we can really share. So that's this year. And when we think big picture, just so you have a sense of where we're going, we've plotted this out 5 years in terms of how we're hoping to work on this. So like I mentioned, this year is really about building those toolkits, building communication tools. And then in 2021, we want to shift and go back and pilot additional tools for the social justice and health and wellness impact areas, so we can add those to the toolkit and really build it out so that it represents each of those 5 impact areas. And then spend some time developing the communication tools and toolkit around that. And then really in 2023 be rolling out kind of that full toolkit that we're looking at. So that's what we're hoping for and where we are planning to head, and would love to take some time to answer some of those questions that are popping up in the chat box. So please type them in there.
Yes, and my apologies for not being able to multitask better. I have a 3-year-old and a 6-year-old, so you would think I would be better at it, but I guess higher order thinking is not, and multitasking. Okay, so what types of programs are being evaluated? I think I spoke to that a little bit, and I just realized my video's not on. It wasn't super intentional, but here we are now. So what types of programs? For the survey and focus groups, they were week-long overnights or about that. And then the age group being taught were mostly rising middle schoolers. So 5th grade through 8th grade was the bulk of our group this year. And as Katie said, the EE21 survey was specifically designed for 5th grade and up. And Mark Stern and Bob Powell, if you're familiar with their work, they're the movers and shakers behind the instrument. And they piloted it in over 400 organizations across the country. And they feel like 5th grade is the absolute lowest you should go. And so in working with our communities, that was also a question we had was, hey, if we use this tool, we think it would be a good tool. But is this a good fit for your audiences? And it ended up being fine in terms of the audiences they were serving. They were serving 5th grade and up. But in terms of the length of the survey, it's much more feasible for a high schooler to fill it out. But even then, it's a little long. And that's the feedback we've been getting from the organizations, and also being a part of this case study work. Oregon has piloted this survey throughout the state. They have the Oregon Outdoor Schools, which is funding for the state. Anyway, they use that with all of their kiddos that move through that program, and that has been some feedback that they've received as well. Are there plans to develop tools for younger audiences? Yes, there are a ton of great tools that are already developed, and that's another part of the work that we're doing is we're trying to plug into what already exists. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. There are a ton of great tools and resources that are already developed, that have already been validated, that can work well for this community. And so plugging into those. For younger audiences, we tend to steer away from surveys just because in terms of experiences, so think about asking a kindergarten, a 1st grader, 2nd grader, to kind of think through these experiential learning questions and having to assign a score to that. It's a little bit more clunky. There are tools that you can use with them. Martha Monroe just came out with a book that really looks at nature connection, which is really what we see in the younger audiences, and what would be most appropriate to be looking at to measure is kind of nature connection. And then in terms of positive youth development, it would be more about like life satisfaction with younger kiddos and kind of a happiness type scale. Because I was just in a conversation with the Positive Youth Development Advisory Council, Lincoln Larson and Ed Bowers, and they said, what looks like resilience and wholeness and well-being for a 3rd grader looks different for a 5th grader, and that's totally true. So yes, developing tools for younger audiences. There are a ton out there, but we don't yet have that in our toolkit. That's something that will evolve too.
And Corey, if I could add on to that, I think the way at least I'm looking at this process right now is, unfortunately, there is no silver bullet in terms of like, this tool is going to work for everyone. Mm-hmm. And so you start to have a toolkit that's going to have quite a few different tools in it. And so the way we're thinking about this, or at least the way I'm thinking about it right now, is that probably once we have created this toolkit that has this menu of different tools that someone could select based on the audience and based on the outcomes that you're looking at, that the collective part of that survey, or that data collection and analysis, we'd never be able to do all of it at the same time, just because it's too much to collect all at once. And so we might have a year where we're focusing on, say, the conservation outcomes, and pick a few tools and invite who's ever using those particular tools to join into the collective part of the evaluation. And then, you know, the next year we might look at something different so that we're able to get a comprehensive picture, but not all at the same time is kind of how we're thinking about that.
Yeah, and Liz, I'll get to your question in just a second, but Amy's question about to what extent do the toolkits overlap? We're not yet there, but our hope, like Katie was saying, is that essentially, you know, here's the challenge with doing collective evaluation is that you want on the analysis side of things that measures have to be able to speak to each other. And you have to know that what you're using, say I'm using a nature connection scale for K through second, and then I'm going to use the EE21 scale for my middle schoolers. You need to understand which questions are similar enough to be compared across those two to speak to how these roll up collectively. Now, it's entirely possible that in this toolkit development, you're going to have toolkits that are age specific just because of how that works. K through second, and then, you know, third through fifth, and then sixth through high school, they're developmentally different. And so that may be a way to think about approaching the toolkits is from an age perspective. But ideally on the back end, all of these regardless of what tool you use for which age group, they go into a data repository that can then be analyzed from kind of a high level outcomes thinking perspective, if that makes sense. So it won't necessarily be super program specific in terms of how we're thinking about it collectively, but the idea would be that by participating in this, you're getting evaluation for your program as well. So it serves both ends of that spectrum. You're getting programmatic evaluation that rolls up to population level or community-wide evaluation, so that as an organization, you can say, here's what we're doing, and here's how it rolls up to the larger community. So we are a part of a bigger system. And we think, based on our conversation with funders, that is a really interesting model, and to be able to have data to speak to that can be really valuable. And then Liz, your question, difference between time to do the tool versus time to analyze. So that's a good question. The hope for this, but it's all about sustainability, and it comes down to funding. Analysis is cost prohibitive for a lot of organizations, and I think that's where a lot of organizations end up stopping in terms of their data collection. When I was running a summer camp, we had binders full of summer program evaluation that we just didn't get a chance to analyze because reality, like we just didn't, our focus, like Katie was saying, it was on programs, and we chose to prioritize programs and not data analysis. Ideally, there is somebody who has the skill set or a group of people to support this community in that ongoing analysis of the data. We do have some support for the survey analysis through Pisces, and Bob and Mark are going to be hiring a grad student to help do that kind of more robust, statistically significant analysis and understanding how different scales speak to one another, which is really cool. But it takes time and it takes money to do that. So from a time perspective, the survey took between 20 and 30 minutes-ish. And then the focus groups, most of the focus groups were less than 20 minutes. And some of them were even shorter than that. But it gives an opportunity for the kids to come together as a group and to share their experience. I will say, from a qualitative perspective, focus groups are the lowest lift tool you can use because you're basically at one point in time capturing feedback from all of your kiddos at once. Ideally, you can do that over time, but that's another issue. And then qualitative analysis does take more time than quantitative analysis. We use Google Forms and Google Docs, and they spit out basic descriptive statistics for us, and we can use Excel to plug in some numbers, and we get a pretty quick response. When you're using quantitative software for statistical analysis. It's a matter of cleaning the data and plugging it in, and then the software does the analysis for you. So you can get pretty quick results. Qualitative, again, it's literally sitting down and reading through the transcripts, coding those, cross-checking that to make sure that what you are interpreting is the right thing. So it's more time intensive to do qualitative analysis. Is it overall about the same? I think the qualitative is more fun for organizations to do. At least that's what we've heard. And from an analysis perspective, it's fun to analyze that. But I don't know. I think it's maybe a toss up. Maybe they end up being shaking out about the same at the end of all of it. And did organizations or evaluators analyze the data? Yes, we are. So we're currently working on analyzing the data. The organizations have not done that. And we will be coming back together. We did come together for our third workshop in December, where we looked at the preliminary findings of the data. And then we'll be coming back together next week to talk about kind of what to do with the findings. So the organizations didn't have any hand in the data analysis other than trying their hand at doing some coding.
Yeah, I think, Corey, I would just add that it's a really important part of our process that organizations learn how to do the data analysis and are able to take that back and build their capacity to do that to their organization. So we did spend time on that, even though Corey is doing the majority of the analysis.
Yes, we tried to, in the spirit of building evaluation capacity, we tried to have the organizations participate as much as possible in the planning process. They did an evaluation planning workshop where they looked at developing an evaluation plan for their organization and trying to tie it back into the larger one. The tools, we really, pushed them and challenged them to try the tools out. And Katie and I were just chatting ahead of this, the lessons that we've learned now in retrospect, but that's the whole purpose of a pilot. And I think, Liz, it was in an earlier conversation, either this week or last week, where you were saying something about it's all theoretical until you actually put it into practice. And it sounds great and looks great on paper. And we spent 3 years developing this plan. So we thought we had it nailed. But we've learned, and it's great. And it's just an ongoing process. And more than anything, I think we've realized that we knew this took time, but it takes a lot more time than I think we anticipated. And that's okay if it means that as a community, we're getting to a place where we can really elevate and share our story in a way that's backed up by sound, solid data. Any other, and feel free to unmute yourself too if you'd rather ask a question as opposed to typing it in.
Well, I think if there aren't any questions, and we'll keep watching to see if any more pop up on the screen, we're, I think, very excited about what we've learned through this process and how we can make it even better. And I think the real takeaway here is that I think in terms of embedding evaluation practices into your work, the more you can be talking to other people about it, the easier that will become. And so our goal is to really think about how we can create those opportunities for organizations to be talking together, and also to really create tools that will help you share the great work that you're doing. So whether you use the tools that we provide or not, that there are tools to help you think about how to communicate that. And so we're really excited about what that might look like. And we hope all of you will consider participating in the workshops in the fall. I don't have this written down or in front of me, so I might get it a little wrong, but I believe we're looking at Denver, Colorado Springs, Durango, and Grand Junction for workshops, to hopefully move around the state a little bit and go into more detail about how to actually use these tools, put them in your hands. And so we can have more organizations experimenting with them, seeing how it works, giving us feedback back so we can continue to improve this and have this amazing, robust toolkit that organizations across the state can use and hopefully benefit from if it makes sense. So that is our hope. So I believe someone asked, when will we be able to attend a workshop to hear about the evaluation tools? I'm going to forget the order of them, so we'll follow up. Nell will send out an evaluation after this call, and we'll put in there the tentative schedule for those workshops. But they're starting in August. So August, September, October, and November, I believe, are the four workshops to give us a little time to pull this toolkit together and take all of these great learnings and make sure that we figure out the best way to roll it out. So great question.
Yeah, and we will be putting together a brief on our findings as well. And so stay tuned for that to kind of get a more in-depth dive if you're interested. I think we'll probably share that with the community at large, or, you know, you can email Katie or myself as well to get access to that. That will probably be ready at the end of February, early March.
Well, we so appreciate everyone's time and interest in this topic. I know Corey and I are both super excited about it and about the possibilities of how we could really use it and roll it out. So as ideas pop up, as Corey said, please feel free to shout them out and let us know what your needs are so we can be thinking about that. We will share more as we have more, but again, thank you so much for your time today, and look forward to seeing you all in person sometime soon.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.